Salam, peace be upon you. My name is Mohammed Layiq Sediqi, the father of Holophase. Part 34. Constraint Chains. How higher derivatives depend on lower. Remember the language we are learning. There is one field, phi, the holophase. One continuous cyclic movement from which all of reality unfolds. When phi begins to change, its first derivatives appear, and with them, three dimensions show themselves at once. Time as omega, space as k, and motion as v, built from both. Every higher derivative is a finer question about how phi changes, and each one casts three shadows together: a time shadow, a space shadow, and a motion shadow. These echoes mix and weave into one another, forming the patterns we call fields, particles, bodies, thoughts, and worlds. In this picture, everything that exists is a living tapestry of phi, endlessly echoing through its derivatives and their dimensional shadows. Today, in this part, we pause again to listen carefully to just one of those echoes. Our journey through the holophase language has already revealed a magnificent landscape. We have explored the letters, the grammar of waves and interference, the quadratic realm of intensity and balance, and the supreme principle of global optimization through action. We have seen how every meaningful pattern dances in the triune light of time, space, and motion. But a profound question still remains. What organizes this vast, potentially infinite hierarchy of derivatives? Why does the world in all its complexity feel lawful and predictable, not chaotic and arbitrary? Today, we discover the hidden architecture that gives the language its backbone. We enter the domain of hierarchy and recursion, beginning with constraint chains, the way higher derivatives depend on lower ones. This is where we learn that the universe is not free to choose any story. Its vocabulary is infinite, but its grammar is strict. The higher levels of the story are not independent inventions. They are logically and dynamically bound to the foundations. To feel this, imagine the ladder of questions we have been climbing. The first derivative of phi asks, how is phi changing? This gives us omega as a rate in time and k as a rate in space. The second derivative asks a finer question. How is that change itself changing? This gives us acceleration, curvature, and drift. The third derivative asks, and how is that changing? This gives us what we call jerk, the rate of change of acceleration. We can imagine this ladder of questions ascending forever, each step asking for a more nuanced detail about the unfolding of phi. At first glance, it seems like an infinite tower of independent details, a potentially chaotic explosion of information where every level is free to do anything. But the cosmos we inhabit is not like that. The motion of a planet is smooth. The vibration of a string is coherent. The growth of a plant follows a recognizable pattern. This tells us a secret. The answers to the higher questions are not free. They are constrained by the answers to the lower ones. You cannot arbitrarily choose a position, a velocity, an acceleration, and a jerk all independently. Once you choose a few, the others are forced into line by the deep logic of change itself. To make this vivid, imagine tracking a car's journey along a straight road. First, there is the position of the car, which we can call x. That is like phi itself, the primary variable describing where you are. Then there is the velocity, v, which tells you how fast and in what direction the car is going. That is the first derivative, our motion shadow, born from the underlying time and space derivatives. Next comes the acceleration, a, which tells you whether the car is speeding up or slowing down. That is the second derivative. Finally, there is jerk, j, which tells you how smoothly the car is changing its acceleration. Is the driver pressing the gas pedal gently, or is there a sudden lurch forward? That is the third derivative. Now imagine that I give you the car's position, velocity, and acceleration as complete, continuous functions of time. I tell you where the car is at every moment, how fast it is going at every moment, and how its speed is changing at every moment. Do you also need to be told the jerk as an independent function? The answer is no. You can calculate it. Jerk is just the derivative of acceleration with respect to time. If you already know how acceleration changes in time, then the jerk is fixed. It is not an independent degree of freedom. It is chained, bound to the acceleration function. If I try to give you a history where the jerk was completely independent of the derivative of the given acceleration, the story would be mathematically inconsistent. It would be like saying the car's acceleration is increasing at a steady rate of 2 meters per second cubed, but also its jerk is 5 meters per second cubed. Those numbers contradict each other. The finer description must match the coarser one. This is what we call a constraint chain. The value of the n plus 1th derivative is constrained to be the derivative, in time or space, of the nth derivative. It is a grammatical rule. The answer to a finer question must be consistent with the way the answer to the coarser question evolves. In the Holophase language, these constraint chains are the core syntactic grammar. If the derivatives are like the words in a sentence, then a constraint chain is like a rule of grammar that says the verb must agree with the subject in number and person, or you cannot suddenly change tense without explanation. The rule that jerk equals the time derivative of acceleration is a simple but inflexible grammatical constraint. It says you cannot just insert any jerk word after an acceleration word. The jerk word has to be the logical continuation of the acceleration word story. These chains exist not only in time, but also in space, and in combinations, binding spatial derivatives to each other and binding mixed derivatives, such as those that describe shear, twist, or curvature, into a complex web. Linguistically, constraint chains act as syntax enforcers. They prevent nonsense sentences. They ensure that a sentence about phi's change is consistent from the broad strokes down to the fine details. They are what make the language parsable and predictable. Scientifically, these chains arise from the very definition of a derivative. They are tautologies of calculus. Their power does not come from being additional physical laws, but from being the prerequisite logical structure upon which physical laws are built. They are the rules of the framework before we even specify the content. Once you see this, you realize that these grammatical constraints have a monumental consequence. They drastically reduce the space of possible stories that phi can tell. An infinite tower of completely independent derivatives would mean an infinite number of knobs to turn at every point, creating a reality of unimaginable arbitrary complexity, a chaotic soup in which almost anything could happen next. But with constraint chains, the knobs are coupled. Once you set the initial conditions for phi and a small number of its first derivatives, the chain of constraints combined with the dynamical laws determines all higher derivatives. The evolution is no longer a free-for-all. It is a single, coherent curve threading through the huge space of possibilities. This is why physics is predictive. We do not need to measure the jerk of a planet to predict its future position. We measure its position and velocity, we know the relevant force law that constrains its acceleration, and then the constraint chain tells us what all the higher derivatives must be doing in order to remain consistent. The universe speaks in stories that are smooth, continuous, and highly structured, not in stories that introduce wild, disconnected twists at every moment. Seen from the perspective of the master tree of the Holophase language, this idea explains the very structure of the tree itself. The tree is not a flat list of independent branches. It is a dependency graph. At the roots, we have phi and its first derivatives, omega, k, and v. On the second level, we have quantities such as acceleration, curvature, and drift that depend directly on the roots. You cannot have curvature without first having a concept of spatial change, and you cannot have acceleration without first having velocity. On the third level, we have things like jerk, the rate of curvature change, and higher order drifts that depend on the second level, and so on as we climb upward. Each higher branch is a refinement, a sub-question, of the branch below it. You cannot jump straight to discussing the twist of a shear field without first establishing that there is a shear field, which itself requires spatial variation and continuity. The lines that connect nodes in the tree are therefore not just lines of association. They are lines of constraint and logical necessity. The tree is a map of allowed conversational pathways in the holophase language. You must speak of velocity before you can meaningfully speak of acceleration, and you must speak of acceleration before you can meaningfully speak of jerk. This is also the heart of why the holophase framework makes sense as a scientific language. By recognizing that physics is about describing patterns in a single field, using this hierarchical, constrained, derivative language, we understand why science can work as a predictive enterprise. Because of the constraint chains and the dynamical laws, which themselves are expressed in only low-order derivatives, we can never measure the infinite tower of derivatives and yet still infer the future. We do not need to measure everything. Measuring a finite set of initial conditions is enough to determine the entire future evolution, including all the unmeasured higher-order details. The language is compressive. Physical laws like Newton's second law or the wave equation are not separate from the constraint chains. They are additional constraints that sit on top of them. The derivative chain says that acceleration is the time derivative of velocity. Newton's law says that force divided by mass equals acceleration. Together, they form a system that fully determines the velocity as a function of time once forces and initial velocities are known. The constraint chain provides the skeleton of possible motions. The law provides the muscles and tendons that move that skeleton in specific ways. Falsifiability also emerges from this picture. If the world were not governed by such chains, any measurement could be followed by almost any other measurement. Prediction would be impossible. The fact that we can make precise, testable predictions and that they succeed so often is powerful evidence that the underlying reality obeys this kind of constrained, hierarchical grammar. These constraint chains are not confined to the time dimension. They weave through all three echoes of time, space, and motion. In the time echo, the chain is most familiar. We talk about position, velocity, acceleration, jerk, snap, and so on as successive derivatives with respect to time. This sequence enforces temporal smoothness. A function of time that has sharp corners or jumps in its derivatives may still appear in effective descriptions, but for a fundamental field in the holophase view, we expect a deeper smoothness beneath those apparent kinks, because an actual infinite tower of independent time derivatives would break the chain. In the space echo, constraint chains bind local values to their neighbors. The gradient tells you how phi changes from point to point. The curvature tells you how that change itself varies as you move. These are linked by spatial derivative rules, such as the Laplacian. This enforces spatial coherence. You cannot have an arbitrarily jagged structure at the fundamental level without invoking very high spatial derivatives that must still fit into the chain. In the motion echo, the constraint chains bind time and space together. For a moving wave packet, its group velocity, expressed as the derivative of omega with respect to k, links the temporal frequency spectrum to the spatial wave number spectrum. This is a chain not of derivatives of a single variable, but of a relationship between derivatives in different dimensions. In this way, the motion itself becomes a constrained variable dictated by the joint structure of time and space. In the holophase language tree, the concept of constraint chains is the structural backbone of the entire hierarchical and recursive tower. It is the first and most fundamental principle of that tower. Before we can talk about self-similarity, recursion, or the emergence of new properties at new levels, we must understand how the levels are connected and dependent. Constraint chains provide that understanding. They sit beneath and support everything else in the hierarchy. They explain why the tree has the shape it does and why some branches are higher than others. They turn what would otherwise be a mere list of concepts into a logically ordered generative structure. This concept is also deeply related to all the neighboring semantic branches we have already explored. At the level of the core alphabet, the constraint chains define the essential relationship between the letters themselves. Omega is constrained by its relation to phi as a temporal derivative. K is constrained by its relation to phi as a spatial derivative. V is born from the relationship between omega and k through the dispersion grammar. In the dynamical realm, the action principle provides the specific equations of motion that pick out one evolutionary path from the infinite set of grammatically possible paths that satisfy the bare derivative constraints. The chains provide the syntax, the action supplies the semantics of which story is actual. In wave semantics, dispersion relations are beautiful examples of derivative constraints that link time and space derivatives. They are not arbitrary. They emerge from the action principle for wave-like solutions. In quadratic semantics, conservation laws derived from Netter's theorem can be seen as global, integrated constraint chains that apply not to a field's value directly, but to tallies of its activity. And in future topics, when we talk about recursion and emergence, we will see that constraint chains are what allow patterns at one level to become stable building blocks at a higher level, because the internal degrees of freedom of those patterns are themselves governed by similar chains. At the semantic level, the meaning of constraint chains is that they are the dimension of narrative consistency and logical follow-through. In any good story, events do not just happen randomly. They follow from what came before. A character's actions must be consistent with their established personality and circumstances. Constraint chains are the mathematical embodiment of this narrative principle in the story of Phi. They ensure that the universe's story is not a sequence of unrelated scenes. A planet's sudden, unexplained leap to a new orbit would violate a vast web of constraints linking its position, velocity, and the surrounding gravitational field. Such an event would be ungrammatical. The chains are what make reality intelligible. They are the reason we can reason from causes to effects, from past to future. They form part of the bedrock of logic within the physical world. These ideas also connect directly to stability, variability, and testability. A system whose state obeys all relevant derivative constraints and dynamical equations is in a consistent state. That consistency is a kind of stability. A violation would be an inconsistency, a kind of internal tension that the system would immediately seek to resolve, often by radiating away excess detail in the form of waves, heat, or turbulence, until a smoother, more consistent pattern is restored. The specific form of the chains varies from theory to theory. In classical mechanics, the primary chains are kinematic. In electromagnetism, the chains link electric and magnetic fields and their derivatives in Maxwell's equations. In general relativity, the chains link the metric, which encodes the geometry of spacetime, to its curvature and to the distribution of matter and energy in a deeply interwoven way. Testing whether the world obeys such chains happens every time we fit models to data. If we assume that higher derivatives are truly independent degrees of freedom, we very quickly get models that overfit noise and fail to predict new behavior. When we assume that higher derivatives are chained to lower ones and constrain our models accordingly, we get robust predictive theories with very few free parameters. The long record of success of such constrained models is strong evidence that the world really does obey these chains. You can also learn to see constraint chains directly in the world around you. Watch any smooth motion, a bird gliding, a leaf falling, a dancer turning. Do not just see the path. Feel the invisible hand of constraint. The smooth arc is not just a random curve. It is the unique curve that satisfies the relevant equations of motion and the derivative constraints given the initial conditions. When you listen to a melody, notice how the next note is not completely free. It is constrained by the key, the rhythm, and the melodic contour built so far. A satisfying resolution is the auditory feeling of a constraint being honored. When you observe a social trend, such as a fashion or a new phrase spreading through a community, you can see that its growth rate is constrained by the network of connections and by human psychology. It cannot explode everywhere at once from nowhere. It must follow chains of influence. There is a beautiful mirror of this in mathematics and computation. When we solve differential equations numerically, we build algorithms that respect the constraint chains. A numerical integrator steps a system forward in time by updating positions and velocities in a way that is consistent with the prescribed accelerations and forces. Good integrators are designed to preserve these relationships as accurately as possible. If the integrator breaks the chains badly, the simulation drifts into nonsense. Energy explodes, orbits fall apart, waves deform unphysically. When the chains are honored, long simulations of planetary systems or climate patterns remain stable and meaningful. The success of these algorithms is another indirect confirmation that the world really does follow derivative based constraints, because algorithms that mimic those constraints track reality so well. Constraint chains also clarify why certain pathological mathematical functions, although perfectly legal on paper, are unlikely to describe fundamental physics. We can cook up functions that are continuous but nowhere differentiable, or that have derivatives that jump wildly from point to point. Such objects break the calm, nested hierarchy of derivatives. To represent them in our language, we would need an enormous amount of independent, uncorrelated information at each derivative level, which conflicts with the compressive, chained structure we observe in real systems. In effective theories, we might approximate messy, small-scale behavior with abrupt changes or kinks, but underneath these lies a smoother, well-behaved field that respects the chains. The holophase view suggests that the true underlying phi field is of this smoother, chain-respecting kind. This way of thinking also lifts naturally into the informational and semantic side of the holophase program. When you reason about a problem, you are unconsciously building your own constraint chains between ideas. A conclusion that does not follow from its premises is like a jerk that does not follow from its acceleration. It breaks the derivative chain of thought. Logical inference, careful argument, and even good storytelling are all human arts of respecting and exploiting such chains. A powerful idea is one that, once introduced at a low level, forces many higher level implications to fall into place, just as a simple differential equation can generate rich, high order behavior. In this sense, the universe and the human mind are practicing the same discipline, crafting long, coherent chains from simple generative rules. In everyday life, you can treat this as an invitation to look for chains, whenever you feel that one thing naturally follows from another. When you notice that a friend's reaction makes sense given their history, you are sensing a psychological constraint chain. When a small daily habit steadily bends the course of your life, you are living inside a behavioral constraint chain. When a piece of music or a well-told story feels as if it could not have unfolded differently, you are witnessing a narrative constraint chain. In each case, higher-level details are not arbitrary. They arise as the smooth continuation of what has already been set in motion. Finally, we return once more to the one field, phi, and to the complete holophase tree. The infinite tower of possible derivatives once looked like a thread of chaos, an unbounded explosion of complexity. But we have now seen that the tower is not a heap of loose bricks. It is a carefully built structure in which each brick is mortared to the one below it by the logic of calculus and by the specific dynamics encoded in the action. The constraint chains are that mortar. They are what make the holophase language a language of coherent stories rather than a babble of disconnected syllables. They are the reason the single, silent movement of phi can express itself as a cosmos of lawful, predictable, and yet endlessly varied phenomena. With this understanding of the backbone of the tree, we are ready to explore how this hierarchical structure can fold back on itself, giving rise to self-similarity, recursion, and the emergence of entirely new levels of meaning, which will complete our journey through this chapter of the holophase language. As we close this part, let us hold one last image. The world is a tapestry being woven in real time. The single golden thread is phi. The loom on which it is woven is built from constraint chains. They are the rigid yet intricate mechanism that controls how the thread may be laid down. They dictate that a certain type of underthread, like velocity, must be followed by a certain type of overthread, like acceleration, which in turn is followed by jerk and higher derivatives, creating a specific lawful texture. Because of this loom, the tapestry is not a random mess of thread. It has patterns that repeat, evolve, and combine in stable and meaningful ways. We call these patterns the laws and phenomena of physics. You yourself are a pattern in this tapestry. Your body is a complex solution of constraint chains in biochemical and mechanical fields. Your thoughts are constrained cascades of neural derivatives. Your life is a narrative path through a high-dimensional space of possibilities. shaped by a million intersecting chains of cause, habit, and physical law. To understand constraint chains is to understand the loom. It is to see that the freedom of the cosmos is not the freedom of pure arbitrariness, but the freedom of a master poet working within the strict and beautiful rules of a chosen form. The constraints do not stifle creativity, they make coherent expression possible. And with that, you have now learned the fundamental rule of this cosmic loom. With this rule in hand, you are ready to see how the most intricate and beautiful patterns of all are woven in the chapters that follow. Salam, and peace be upon you.